Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 74th episode of the Atlas Society Asks. My name is Jennifer Anju Grossman. My friends call me Jag. I am the CEO of the Atlas Society. We are the leading nonprofit organization introducing young people to the ideas of Ayn Rand in fun, creative ways like graphic novels, animated video, living history. Today, we are joined by Blake J. Harris. Before I even begin to introduce our guest, I wanted to remind all of you who are joining us, not just on Zoom, but watching us on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, type your questions into the comment stream. We're going to try to get to as many of them as we can. So Blake J. Harris is someone that I have been following for a while. He's a writer and a filmmaker whose work has appeared in many outlets like ESPN and Fast Company. He is a two-time best-selling author, Console Wars, Sega, Nintendo, and the Battle that defined a generation. He and his partners made that into a documentary, which is just a thrill to watch. He is also author of The History of the Future, Oculus, Facebook, and the Revolution That Swept Virtual Reality. So Blake, welcome again. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. In line with your mission, I was once a young person. I know it's hard to believe. And I was very influenced by Ayn Rand's books. They were among, they still stand as some of my favorites. And I don't think I would be where I am today without reading them. So it's an honor to be here.
And we did not know that going into this interview. But now that I do, I could see why Atlas Shrugged as a great American novel about business, about people coming together, innovating, Reardon Medal, and coming up against obstacles and finding innovative solutions. I can now see some of that, in your work. So, as you know, Palmer Luckey is speaking at our gala in Malibu coming up in 3 weeks and 1 day. And your book, The History of the Future, is in part Palmer's story, as well as the story of Oculus, the story of virtual reality. And, without giving too much of a spoiler, it also includes kind of a cautionary tale about cancel culture. And I get the sense that the story that you wrote was not necessarily the one that you set out to write, because you were doing interviews and research in real time. So you could not have predicted the way that things turned out. So let's maybe take a step back and start with what got you interested in the subject to begin with, and how you got started.
Sure. You're absolutely right. We can talk more about how the story changed and how my life changed telling that story. But what really fascinated me was the technology, virtual reality to a degree, but it was Palmer. It is an ensemble story, but Palmer's the lead character. For those who don't know Palmer, you should. He was 19 years old in 2012 when he founded a company called Oculus, whose mission was to bring virtual reality to the masses. They created a headset that were launched on, like a virtual reality headset that you put on and you can see into a virtual world and have an immersive experience. They launched on Kickstarter. They raised over $2 million. It was, one of the highest, most successful Kickstarters of all time. And then 2 years after that, when Palmer was only 21, the company was sold to Facebook for $3 billion. We'll talk about why he's no longer at Facebook and what he's done since then and how he's bounced back stronger than ever. But yeah, I love stories about entrepreneurs. I think that business stories are also the most entertaining stories. I know that some people think that they're dry, but I think, there's inherent stakes to almost all business stories, and especially when it intersects with culture and technology. It's just really fascinating. Like you said, those are themes that are present in Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead. And And I don't think coincidentally, even though not intentionally, in my work. And so I wanted to see the story of, how how he went from idea to company to, being acquired for several $billions to no longer being at that company. And of course, it was not just him. His co-founders were incredibly important, and so were so many people along the way. But he's a very fascinating, mesmerizing guy.
Yeah, no, even the early story of him, all of his quirks, living in this trailer parked in his parents' garage, but then having this idea, just also reaching out, to various people that could help him and not being deterred. And then, finding and understanding as well, like, well, I've got this idea, I've got this invention. I know, the hardware, I know the software to an extent, but I don't know how to raise money, or I don't have the connections, or I, don't know marketing. And so just seeing how that team came together and, for the most part, for a while, worked together pretty well. So, so this is a show we often talk about philosophy, we talk about culture, we talk about politics. So this is a bit of a departure for us. And but in terms of our audience and the broader public's familiarity with virtual reality, it was popularized by, again, science fiction books. Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson, Ernest Cline's Ready Player One. Of course, that was made into a tremendous hit movie by Steven Spielberg for Warner Brothers. And Ernest Cline, I should also mention, you somehow landed to write the foreword to your book. So for the uninitiated who don't know what, virtual reality is, it might actually be helpful to talk a little bit about those two novels as a way of, giving them a sense of what the potential is and what the vision is.
Yeah, absolutely. So Ready Player One by Ernest Cline came out, I think, in 2011, 2012. It was around the same time. It was within a year of when Palmer started Oculus. And the timing, there was something to that timing because whereas, like you mentioned, most virtual reality has existed in science fiction, and it's always been this very futuristic, sometimes dystopic thing. But Ready Player One seemed to introduce technology that existed today, or that was very close to existing. And the idea was that in the future, I think it was in the year 2033, most people lived in trailers. Not much of the everyday physical world was explored. And every morning people would put on a headset, and this headset would be so immersive, you would feel like you were in another place. And just for those uninitiated, a very small example of what that means is if you're, it's not just a 3D effect. It's the fact that when you turn your head, the world doesn't turn with you, like as if you were, looking at a television. You actually have a 360-degree view of your environment. You can move forward, you can move backward. And there's a lot of benefits to this idea that you could be anywhere at any time, that I could feel like I was in that room with you right now. Or even some things like I remember I got a really big, it opened up something in my head one time when, like right now I have a 45 or 50-inch television, but if you put on a virtual reality headset, there was an application that made you feel like you were in a movie theater, and suddenly you're sitting in a movie theater with a 80-foot screen, and it really feels like you're watching an 80-foot screen. So you can play with scale and things like that. And I thought that the technology was really fascinating because it actually felt like what Oculus had developed, Palmer's invention. You actually felt like you were somewhere else. Like I remember the first time I took a demo, I remember thinking to myself that if someone were to punch me in the stomach right now, it would take me like a half a second to respond because I didn't really feel like I was in my physical body. I felt like I was somewhere else. And so it's this really incredible technology. For Palmer and his co-founders, it was about gaming. It was about stepping into the game. It was about this next generation of what gaming could be, where you're not just, playing in front of a screen, but you're stepping into the screen. And then, Facebook saw what Oculus was doing and liked the gaming, but they unsurprisingly, like the social aspect, this idea that, instead of watching a basketball game on your television, you could put on a headset and feel like you're sitting in the front row. And they made a big investment in Oculus and in virtual reality.
Yeah, no, in virtual reality, I think you describe how Palmer said, well, he had this vision. He wanted to get to this kind of Ready Player One virtual world, and made a bet that gaming was going to be the vehicle to get him there. But the world of virtual reality is not just gaming, it is social, it is training. The military uses it. There's therapeutic applications, and then also there's just
mentioned that I mentioned that I've written some stuff for Fast Company. One of the first article I wrote for them was about how the United Nations was trying to raise money for refugees in Syria, and instead of asking potential donors, can you give money to this cause? Here's what it's all about. They had an 8-minute short film made with a 360-degree view, so you actually put it on and feel like you're living at a refugee camp. And so there's the sense of presence that you're able to achieve with virtual reality. And Ernie's book, which came out around that time, was really impactful on a lot of people in the tech community, not just as a cool story, but as something that, maybe if they were to leave their jobs at Apple or Google, they could actually help build the infrastructure for what this could be. And they're starting to do that. It's a long ways away. And unfortunately, Palmer's no longer in that business directly in that same way. But my story took a big twist. Originally, as I'm sure will surprise no one, when you set out to write a book with a publisher, you have a contract for, you have a delivery date. Like I had 18 months to write this book, and it ended up taking me 4 years. And not just because I'm a slow writer, but because the story absolutely changed. I don't know if you want to talk
we're going to get to that, but sticking with Palmer's, beginnings.
I'll say this about Palmer. One thing, he is. He's so charismatic. He puts a smile on your face to be around. He's one of the smartest guys I've ever met. I remember, like Jennifer mentioned, setting the stage and the way the book begins is in 2012. He's living in Long Beach, California, technically living with his parents, but he has his own space by living in a trailer outside at the foot of their driveway. And he was describing this trailer to me, and it had basically been totally gutted, and it was turned into a makeshift mad scientist laboratory where he had like 40 different virtual reality headsets. And I said, that kind of sounds like Walter White's meth man in Breaking Bad. And he's like, yeah, it was basically like that, but for virtual reality. And just something that felt so Palmer to me was, his girlfriend, who is now his wife, Nicole Edelman. She was also on this call the one time I was talking to him and about that. And she said, it was so terrible. And Palmer was like, no, I loved it. Like he was able to find joy in the simpler things in life. To him, living in a trailer felt like living in a spaceship. And he just has a really odd, optimistic way of looking at the world.
I remember at some point in your book, after the company is sold, they are going to move up to Silicon Valley, and but he has the idea that we're going to go and live in a junkyard. So that seemed like a great idea to him. But I have not yet met him, but I am looking forward to that. And I wanted to remind all of you who are watching that you have the opportunity to meet him too, and not just in virtual reality. So we'll put the link to the gala in the chat, but you will also have an opportunity virtual. There is a virtual option, but it's not going to be virtual reality option yet. But given
I think is worth saying on the subject that I probably should have said earlier is just that virtual reality, for those of us who are our age, remember growing up in the 80s and 90s, and it felt like virtual reality was this thing that was right around the corner. Like if you had pulled me when I was 10 years old and said, when's virtual reality coming? I'd say, in 5 years. And then it never did. And it sort of became this technological punchline like flying cars or jetpacks. And that made people think it wasn't possible. But Palmer, through an odd set of skills, and he was really into portabilizing consoles and, taking retro gaming. And, he developed this fascination with virtual reality. And as you know, one other key player in the story of the book, as well as just the story of Oculus and virtual reality's resurgence, was John Carmack. And he put it really eloquently to me, where he just said that his game that he created, Doom, had been licensed for virtual reality in the 90s. And then he hadn't really thought about virtual reality for 20 years. And he just assumed it had progressed in like a linear or exponential fashion, but it hadn't, because no one had been working on it anymore. And I think that's always just really, it was fascinating to me, because it's, a lot of things in life we just assume are going to happen, but unless someone actually does them, they don't. And also just, the title of the book is The History of the Future, but thinking about the future, I think that we all, to some degree, think that the future is this thing that is that's set in stone, or that there is a future out there. But in reality, it's more like digging up something from the sand, and there's one future if you, like a butterfly effect thing. So I just, I guess a long-winded way of saying that there are people who help make the future, and it's not driven by malicious intent, it's driven by passion and desire, or at least in this case it was, and that was what was so appealing to me.
Right. Well, that the future isn't given, that it isn't predestined, that many of us just wait for it, but then there are other people who actually achieve it. And going back to Ayn Rand, when she was asked about Atlas Shrugged, and they looked at it and they saw what was going on in the world, and they said that it's prophecy. And she said that it was not prophecy in terms of a future that could not be avoided, but it was a testimony to our power to avoid that dystopian future if we choose to change course. So, so writing about the book, you conducted hundreds of interviews. You were granted virtually unlimited access by Oculus Facebook to write about Oculus's founding and the possibilities of virtual reality. But fast forward 2.5 years, this access was abruptly ended. So why is that? What happened?
Sure. So to answer that, we should get into a little bit of what happened with Palmer and why he left the company. And so what happened was in I think September 22nd or September 23rd, 2016, this was 6 weeks before the presidential election between Hillary and Trump. There was an article that came out from the Daily Beast whose headline, which was about Palmer, said, "The Facebook billionaire secretly funding Trump's meme machine." And the main thrust of the article is twofold. One, that Palmer's a Trump supporter and no one knew this, and this was blasphemy in Silicon Valley. And two was that, much more damningly, that every terrible online thing that you've seen for the past election season, everything malicious, homophobic, transphobic, everything bad, basically Palmer was the money behind this, which was absolutely not true. It was true that he's a Trump supporter. And as so is often the case happens these days, the media ran with that narrative. They still believe it's true because it's written somewhere. And it was just absolutely false. And, it was like this game of telephone where the next headline was that Palmer was the Facebook billionaire secretly funding Trump's racist meme machine. And, every headline has to be more sensational than the next. And so when all that happened, I've mentioned that Palmer is a charismatic guy. He's a great natural public speaker and has a good sense. He's very authentic, and people like that about him. And so his authentic desired response was to put out a statement that said, "This is absolutely not true. This, and this. But yes, I am a Trump supporter, and here's why." To actually, show people here's where he's coming from. It's not, like there's a lot of logic to why he was a Trump supporter. I personally am not, and I disagreed and have had a nice debate with him, but he had good reasons, and he wanted to put out that statement, but he was not allowed to. Specifically, Mark Zuckerberg wouldn't let him put out that statement. He had to basically
it was not the statement that ended up being put out under his name.
Right. The statement that ended up being put out under his name was a statement that said that he had donated to this organization. I guess I forgot to mention, he donated $10,000, a little bit less than $10,000 to a 501c3, I think, 501c4 that had put up one billboard. And the billboard said "too big to jail," and it had a caricature of Hillary Clinton looking kind of like a chipmunk. Nothing, like it was very tame as far as political ads go. And so my first thought, even though, like you mentioned, I did hundreds of interviews for the book, I was in touch with Palmer almost every day. But my first thought when I read this article was, if this is true, show me the memes. There was, you'd think an article about all these memes. But anyway, Palmer was forced in the sense that if he wanted to keep his job at Oculus, and to him at that point in his life, Oculus was his baby. It was virtual reality, was everything for the past 5 years. This was his company. He was the face of it. He'd been on the cover of Wired and all these magazines. He was Oculus to most people. So he put out that statement saying that he was supporting Gary Johnson. He put out the statement on Facebook, of course. And then flash forward 6 months, he ends up getting fired. We could talk about what happened. But getting back to why I lost my access to Facebook that I had been granted, sort of unprecedentedly, this incredible access, was I knew that Palmer was a Trump supporter. And I also knew that Palmer was someone who believed it was really important to be honest with people. So it seemed really odd to me that he would write that statement. And when I would ask him directly about it, he said he couldn't answer me, that he was sorry, because, whatever. He wanted to keep his job, and he was abiding by his agreement with Facebook at that time. And the one thing I had noticed was, it was a really silly, stupid thing, but throughout the course of writing the book, there's a lot of times when someone had sent me email. I ended up having access to over 25,000 emails, and it wasn't given to me by Facebook. That part I don't think they would have wanted, but I got access to a lot of people's documents, and then sometimes people would send me screenshots of emails, and then I would type, I would put them on my computer so that it would be searchable. And whenever I would type an email that had come from Palmer, or that was from Palmer, even if he had given it to me, he would always use 2 spaces after a period, and I would give him a lot of. I would jokingly tease him about that, because I always use 1 space. I think that's old school and it's really annoying and takes up space. But I noticed that in his statement on Facebook, he'd only used 1 space. And I was like, all right, I know for sure he didn't write this. So I started to investigate and find out what had really happened, to find out that Mark had written this other statement that he ended up having to write. And the reason I found that out was because a lot of people at Oculus who were really unhappy with how Palmer was being treated, also largely not Trump supporters, people who didn't share his views, but they shared the fact that they didn't like how he was being treated, and that politics should have nothing to do with his being put on suspension or, sort of set aside as things were being figured out. And I got these emails, and then eventually, after I was able to get enough information, and I felt like, during this time, I would ask questions to Facebook employees about what had happened with Palmer, or what was happening with Palmer, who hadn't yet been fired yet, but was basically put on sabbatical, or, was figuring out what he was going to do next. And they told me this fairy tale about what had happened. And it was a concerted effort by a bunch of different members, a bunch of different Facebook members, to tell the same exact narrative. And so when I would fact check with others, they would confirm this, fake story about how Palmer was a Gary Johnson supporter, and they didn't know anything about him being a Trump supporter. They didn't know anything about Mark forcing him to write it. And then eventually I confronted them with some of the evidence that I had uncovered, and they never talked to me again.
That didn't go well.
Didn't go well.
Let's see. Yeah, no, and one of the things you covered in the book was that this successful attempt to get Palmer to lie about, his political support at the time was in fact in opposition to laws, California laws that said you can't force employees to support a candidate, or so that was really very
it was really sad, because laws are very important, and I would never advocate for breaking them, but even more important to me is just the morality. What person with a moral compass would coerce an employee not to share their views or to make them lie about it? And that's part of the problem, I think, of why everyone had and has such a negative opinion of the other political side, and that probably goes both ways, is just not hearing another perspective. And because I remember the first time Palmer mentioned that he was a Trump supporter, I was surprised, because like I said, most people in Silicon Valley are not. But my initial thought wasn't, oh, Palmer is an idiot, or it was, wow, Palmer's a smart guy. I wonder what his reasons are. And I think it would have been helpful for other people to know what his reasons were. And so it was really sad that there was a concerted effort at Facebook to suppress that view and have Palmer lie about it. And that eventually, after 6 months, he was fired. And this clearly had nothing to do with his job as an executive. It had nothing to do with business or virtual reality. It was purely politics, or at most you could say like bad publicity, but the bad publicity was largely caused by Facebook making him lie. And it was just a really eye-opening experience for me. I was actually speaking to all the people involved. I spoke to the people at the organization that Palmer had donated money to. I spoke to the people, I got these emails from Facebook. And what was really sad for me was not just to see Palmer's co-founders turn on him and lie about his, why he left. An example would be that I was told, he had bad performance reviews, because that's something they thought I couldn't verify. But then I got a hold of his performance reviews and they were excellent. But it was really sad for me, being a journalist, is that my first book was largely well received, especially by the tech and gaming community, which was the community that was largely putting out a lot of negative stories about Palmer. And I would reach out to these journalists directly, people who I had a direct, I thought a positive relationship with. I thought they would listen to me. And I said, you have this, and this wrong in your story. Let me send you the information, or can we get on the phone? I want to explain to you why you're wrong and why this is important. And at the end of the day, their response in a nutshell was, well, yeah, maybe we got some stuff wrong, but he's a Trump supporter. And I just thought, like, wow, if my mom said that to me, I would be like, Mom, come on, like, that doesn't matter. But these are journalists. These are, like, of anyone that should, separate that from their work, it should be them. But
right. No, and I know that Palmer had been interested actually in possibly going into journalism early on, but some of even his much earlier than this experience had disillusioned him about the accuracy, the ethics of journalists. And then I think there are also larger cultural trends, particularly now, where people make these cognitive commitments to a particular narrative, and they are not willing to revise it, based on new facts. So,
which is so sad, because that is literally our job as journalists, is to just take the facts and go where they take you. Just like I didn't want to write a book about politics. This is not what I expected. I hate talking about politics. I hate writing about politics, but that's where the story went. You have to go where it takes you. And it was just an eye-opening experience for me in so many ways. I felt so bad for what happened to Palmer. I know that people say, some people think that what happened to him is sort of like a who cares situation because he's very wealthy. And I am sympathetic to that point of view, but I don't think you should care about him. I think you should care about the person who doesn't have billions of dollars, who's going to be going through something like this. And as we've seen, in the years since that happened in 2016 and 2017, it's happened to so many more people. I think it's getting to the point where it feels like most people have a friend or someone they follow closely that's been canceled or been in one of these situations. And one of the shames too, and as you're describing, where people just get locked into a cognitive position is, one of the accusations was that Palmer was racist. And people would ask me, is he really racist? And I'd say, I've spent so many hours with him. Like, I've seen private things that he didn't want me to see. And I would swear on my life he's not. And they're like, yeah, but prove it. I'm like, how do I prove something that's not true? How do you prove something that's not true is not true? And there's no way to do it. And that's oftentimes what people will rest on when they don't want to change their mind. And no amount of evidence seems to persuade them.
Well, in following the story and following the facts and the developments where they led, again, this doesn't come in till about 2/3 or 3/4 of the story. So it really is kind of a surprise to some extent when the story takes that turn. But you had already written Console Wars. It was a runaway bestseller, not just, in the tech press, but got great reviews in the popular press as well. You also experienced, I wouldn't necessarily characterize it as cancel culture, but it was certainly silence culture, just in the way that those two books were received, reviewed or not reviewed. So maybe tell us a little bit about that. Sure. And whether it impacted some of your perspective on politics or culture.
Yeah, it's a good question. So my first book, Console Wars, came out in 2014. It was reviewed by hundreds of publications, like you said, tech, gaming places, as well as just nostalgia things and mainstream press, and for the most part, it was well received, but I liked that it got a broad reach, and people who didn't like it said why they didn't like it, as is their right. My second book came out, and I still don't think there's been a single actual review of it by a member of the press. Fortunately, the book found its audience largely with the help of a very unexpected to me ally in Glenn Beck, who's someone that I, never really thought much about, and probably, I definitely would say I didn't share his views, but he found out about the story and that I was reporting it, and that Palmer shared different politics, and said that this was sort of exactly what we want our journalists to be. Hang on one second.
And I wanted to encourage all of you who are watching, go ahead, type in those questions. We are going to get to some of them. So, yes.
So, I guess to answer your question about my perspective on the issue is that I expected that I expected actually negative reviews. I wasn't expecting no reviews. I don't know which is better or worse. It kind of is irrelevant to me. But having seen what Palmer went through, I knew that what was happening to me was like not worth crying about. Like he got, his life was destroyed. I was just ignored. Unfortunately, it was that sold a lot of copies. So, but I do remember I put out a year before the book came out, I put out sort of a, test balloon, an article. I was just curious how people would react. And I didn't want it to be anything of my view, Blake Harris as an author. It was just it was a list of the headlines that came out about Palmer and the tweets that came out about Palmer within the 24-hour time span that the story broke. And it was just, basically, it was in detail how that game of telephone happens, where one person misreports something and then someone either misinterprets it or maliciously makes it even worse, and it just becomes this gospel. And that was the other thing, when I'd reach out to journalists and say this wasn't true, and even if the ones that were willing to listen to me, I would show them the evidence, and they'd say, yeah, but this guy said this, and I'm like, yeah, but any guy can say anything. And so. Yeah, I mean, I feel very fortunate too. I feel very fortunate that the book was able to find its audience, and sort of to your point, like the book doesn't start off at page one being about what it became. And I think that was always to me a wonderful thing about it. Taking it back to Ayn Rand, those books weren't given to me as, oh, here's a philosophy book. Like,
here's an adventure.
It was this wonderful epic story, this great narrative with great characters, and in the process of following their story, you encounter all these things that you maybe wouldn't have signed up for or known that you would be interested in. And that was, I always hoped that readers would go through the experience similar to how I did as the writer or researcher, where it wasn't what I wanted, set out to write about what I wanted to write about, but it's very important, I believe. It's very sadly interesting. And I do think that it makes it a lot easier to enjoy the success and to look at this case knowing that it knock on wood, that it worked out well for Palmer in the end. Since leaving Oculus, he's founded a defense technology company called Entrepreneurial that's already valued higher than Oculus was. He's saving the taxpayers money and doing really cool defense technology things.
And at the end of the day, did that sort of blackout of press reviews for your book, did it affect sales, or how did the sales of?
It's a good question. It really did at first. When a book comes out, most of its sales will occur within the first week or two. For classic books, that's not necessarily the case, but most, with console wars, most of the sales happened within the first few weeks, and the sales for the first few weeks were okay at best. And then without any way without people hearing about it from other sources than me or readers, without the press, it was sort of dying. And that's when I happened to be on Glenn Beck's show. And so like I said, I have this gratitude for Glenn Beck, that I never expected, but he was wonderful. He really implored his viewers to consider buying the book, or at least to let me on a show a few times to tell the story. And I had some other good press opportunities too. I got to go on Tucker Carlson and talk about it, and some opportunities on Fox News. And, I could honestly say I have appeared on Fox News more than I've ever watched Fox News. I'm grateful to, the audience for listening to the story. It's there's a lot of important things in there. Again, Palmer, I think a lot of people do care what happened to Palmer, but even if you don't care about Palmer directly, you can see what happens to him as just a microcosm of what's going on in our culture in many ways.
Right. Well, we're going to put the link, because we are going to urge our viewers to buy The History of the Future. I actually listened to it on Audible, and that was a lot of fun. And I listened to it, and then I was like, got the book. I'm like, oh my God, that was a big thing. But the book is great because it has like these wonderful pictures of Palmer and his wife and all of their kooky glory.
And I like that you showed those photos too, because I remember after with one of the Facebook Oculus executives, after I sort of, told them that I knew they were lying about Palmer's bad performance review, they went to like excuse number 2 and excuse number 3. And then one of them was like, yeah, but he just doesn't act like an executive. And one of the examples was that, he would go cosplay at these conventions and stuff like that. And that was, he said, could you imagine an Apple executive doing that? And I said to him, I can't imagine myself doing that, but I think you're really we're older, that the world is changing. I can imagine Elon Musk doing that. I can imagine the leaders of tomorrow doing that. People appreciate someone, presenting their authentic self. And that was always something Palmer did. That's why he was so immediately appealing to people. And so. Yeah,
well, you probably couldn't imagine it, but the Atlas Society does it.
Excellent.
As I mentioned, we have graphic novels. One is of Anthem, the other is of Red Pawn, and one of our biggest distribution channels is Comic-Cons. And so I have an Ayn Rand costume and an Ayn Rand impersonation, which actually does enrage a lot of people, but it also delights, and it's something different, that is fun. And I think being willing to be different is important, and it does show, I think, an authenticity. At least, even if you're being authentically stupid, or authentically weird, you're not just following the script of what you're supposed to do because everybody else is doing it.
Well, that word you said, there's a certain delight to it. You can tell that Palmer was having fun, and you're having fun. I think that conveys. And I I remember that I think it was worth sharing as a small example to how, in addition to the media just smearing Palmer with, untruths, the way that these narratives build, you want to get to the business standpoint. You want to try to convince Oculus or Facebook why it's bad for business to have Palmer. And I remember there was 2 developers, game developers, people who make games that were going to make a game for virtual reality, that said the night that the story broke, I'm not going to work with Oculus if Palmer works there. These were 2 companies that had never put out a game, that never did put out a game. And then one of them actually said a week later, after they never saw the memes that Palmer allegedly funded, they said they regretted putting it out. But the media was able to say, oh, Oculus is losing business because of 2 random unverified tweets. And just, that was the tip of the iceberg. But that one always sticks with me. And the fact that company actually had the decency to acknowledge that they had been duped by the media, and still no one cared.
Right. No, and that was sort of a rare exception,
yes,
that you described. So let's get to some of our questions from the audience. Not a question here, but John from Uganda is grateful for the Atlas Society, and we're grateful that you are watching. Cliff Maloney from Facebook. Cliff, I don't know if that is my Cliff. I hope it is. He's been a friend of the Atlas Society. Says, Palmer is the GOAT. What advice does Blake have for up and coming entrepreneurs who are worried about failure? And that's a great question, I think, Blake, because, your story as well, when you were just coming out of college and getting started and making films and figuring it out, and including you had this idea, well, okay, if people aren't showing the film, I'm going to contact colleges and try to get it shown on campus. And I think contacted 400 different campuses and ended up with, I don't know, like a dozen or 20, but behind, and that was the success, but it was being willing to kind of move through the failure. That was one of the entrepreneurial stories I took from your experience, but perhaps you can share some others.
So to keep it to myself, and then we can talk about maybe lessons learned from watching Palmer, was that so out of college, I knew I wanted to be a writer. I had no idea how to monetize that desire. So I had a day job trading commodities for Brazilian clients. So literally from the age 20, 1 week after I graduated from school until literally the day of my 30th birthday, I was selling sugar and coffee and soybean futures for Brazilian clients. And it was not what I wanted to be doing, but it paid the bills. And during that time, like you were describing, I made some films, I wrote screenplays, and I had a situation where a screenplay I wrote sort of like instantly deemed, it was about a dictator, and then Sacha Baron Cohen announced he was doing a dictator movie, so my script became worthless. And that was really hard for me because I realized that much more successful people than me were going to, I understood where the studios were coming from. Of course, they'd rather have a script from Sacha Baron Cohen than from unknown Blake Harris. But that ended up being life-changing in a good way. And I think that this addresses the sense of failure, is that after that, I came to the conclusion that, fortunately turned out to be wrong, that I was not going to ever be a professional writer, that I was never going to make a living doing that. But at the same time, I loved writing, so I was never going to stop. And so my solution was, all right, I'm only going to work on things that I absolutely love. I'm no longer going to try to do things that I think will sell or be commercial. And as is often the case with people I've interviewed, that mentality is what leads to success. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying that, failure is hard to prepare for. And it happens randomly as well as,
because of mistakes, right?
Yeah. As well as because of mistakes, but as we see with Palmer, as long as you are working on something that you love, it's a lot easier to pick up the pieces because you don't stop loving that thing and you still want to grow it or build it or keep moving forward.
Mm-hmm. That's good advice. And then also from console wars, I think that there is a lesson there. You had Sega that was up against a competitor that had 95% of the market, and yet they decided that they could to make a go of it, and actually at some point became the dominant player in that market. What are some of the lessons that sort of entrepreneurial or business lessons that you took away from the console wars?
I think in console wars, as well as the story about Oculus, it really is a team effort, which is actually a very cliche thing. But it's in a way, it's not just the fact that you need different people to wear different hats, or that there's so many responsibilities that everyone needs to be wearing so many hats. To some degree, it was something that there's a part of the book. It's very brief, but Chris Dixon from Andreessen Horowitz, the venture capitalist, told me a story that's in the book, or just this idea that one of the reasons that they invested in Oculus was because of something called the bat signal effect, which was a term that he coined, like putting the bat signal in the air and then Batman comes. But basically with Oculus, it put this thing in the air that attracted other like-minded people. And I think that when I say the team is important, I think it's around being around other true believers is really important, because when you're doing something that people say is impossible, everyone else is going to tell you not to do it, or everyone else is going to tell you you're doing it wrong. And if you have a vision that you believe it should be done differently, or that what you're doing is actually the right way, it helps to have I guess in a sense, that echo chamber in the professional sense, because I think doing any endeavor is a lonely experience, except for those who are also on that same mental space as you, or in that same trajectory as you. So I think that you can learn. And with Council Wars, I guess another good example was that doing just capitalize with Sega. They came to basically acknowledge that Nintendo owned the age 6 to 14 market, and them competing with Nintendo in that regard was worthless, at least early on. So they tried to, turn that lemon into lemonade and say, okay, well then we're just going to go after an older market. And that's a big part of why video games nowadays are for adults, because that was Sega's, explicit intent. Yeah. So, basically trying to figure out where where other competitors are not doing something, and you have the chance to flourish and distinguish yourself.
Well, that resonates with me at the Atlas Society. We're not the only organization that is out there promoting the ideas of Ayn Rand, but we're definitely the Sega to the Nintendo, and so that spirit of finding opportunities, seeing what the big players aren't doing, having a higher tolerance for risk, being able to make changes more nimbly is something that I think you get when you are not the dominant market player.
And one more thing on that that I think will definitely resonate with Ayn Rand's philosophy. The third book I'm working on now is about Larry David, who people may or may not know. He's the co-creator of Seinfeld and the star and creator of Curb Your Enthusiasm. And sort of famously with Seinfeld, which is a show that now it seems almost unanimously hailed, people thought it was a terrible idea. And Larry threatened to quit so many times when the network wanted him to change what the show was, the show about nothing. But he stuck to his guns, and he genuinely was willing to walk away because he didn't want to make something that wasn't his vision. And that is hard to, we all would like to do that. It's difficult to sometimes do that given the practicalities of, feeding our housing ourselves. But what I always loved about Ayn Rand's books was that even, just that feeling it gave me, that confidence. And so maybe I wouldn't be able to be as strong as Rourke. But there was something, but I could strive for that. There's something to strive for.
Yeah, no, I think that her fiction was very different in that it was idealized in a sense. It was focused not just on, mediocre people with their quirks and their foibles. It was heroic characters, the idealized characters, and it did give you something to want to aim for. And I think that theme of independence, and Howard Rourke not compromising his work, even deciding to take a job breaking rocks in a quarry rather than compromise his vision, is something that I think would be a good piece of advice for young entrepreneurs as well. But also to not quit your day job necessarily.
Yeah. And also, I found this to be true. I don't know if it's always true of people, is that I think that because as an artist, and that the Ayn Rand book spoke to me so much, there was this idea, I almost feel like I romanticized being uncompromising. But I've also found that it's important to listen. You don't have to do what the person says, but there's a lot of times when I realized, oh, your idea is better than mine, or, oh yeah, I was kind of wrong about that. And so I feel like in my younger years, I was a little bit more in it to just do my vision, because I got to stick to my vision, but be open, whether it's business or whether it's writing a book, if someone has input, I always try to listen. I mean,
yes, no, and
I say thanks, no thanks.
I think, and that's, if there's an Atlas Society brand, this idea of, yes, we feel confident in our beliefs and in the philosophy, in these principles, in these ideals, but we go in there with a certain amount of understanding that, we could be wrong, and maybe we have something to learn from others. And I think that we can also see it even in Ayn Rand's own journey as a novelist and as a writer, that this quality that served her so well to be able to shut out all of the people that were saying, terrible things about her, given her fierce sort of anti-communist stance at a time when communism was kind of glamorized, at least in Hollywood. But that ability to shut things out also became kind of a detriment when she was perhaps less porous to feedback that was intentioned, wanting to help her, but right. She'd already kind of created that armor. All right, well, we are winding up here. We've got about 10 more minutes and time for other questions. Lawrence asks, do you think that the next leap for virtual reality technology is going to come from independent inventors, or do big tech companies have a stranglehold on the progress, and perhaps more broadly where you see the virtual reality technology going at this point?
It's a great question, because I think that, I would consider myself an idealist, as I maybe hinted at earlier. And when I saw this whole new business potential business landscape, this frontier of virtual reality, my eyes lit up at this idea of the next Google, the next Facebook, and maybe they won't be so evil. And I remember meeting with a VC early on in the project and asking him, if he was investing in what he thought would be the next Google or the next Facebook. And he was hoped that was the case, but he said he thought that virtual reality is going to be a situation where the rich get richer, where it is these big tech companies, and that's largely just because of the costs of doing this. Facebook spends, I would say to their credit, spends billions of dollars a year on the R&D for virtual reality and augmented reality, even though they're not yet making any money. And I say that to their benefit because I like the technology, though I don't like the company. And I think that, I think probably yourself and many of the viewers have had issues with YouTube and some of YouTube's policies. And there's this idea of, why doesn't someone just start another YouTube? And aside from just the difficulty of creating a popular platform, there's just the back end cost. It's a big technological challenge, and it's very expensive. And so it would be really hard for an independent company to compete. I would not say it's impossible, but similar to with console wars, I love that Sega was the scrappy underdog, and I would like to think that maybe nowadays another Sega gets brought up, but it's just unlikely because there's so many. Back then the barrier to entry was millions of dollars, but now it's billions of dollars to develop this technology, and so it's just really, really tough.
We have another question about the role of regulation. So you mentioned generally that you were not a Trump supporter. Palmer was. One of the big things that Trump did at the time was a real focus on deregulation. That's probably going to get changed now, but I was reminded of it in watching Console Wars, because this whole issue of regulating gaming, I think, came up then. I think it continues to be an issue now. Concerns about violence and gore in these games, and whether you have a view on the role that regulation plays. Do we need more regulation of virtual reality and gaming, or should we let the market work it out?
I feel like there's a third option. I feel like we should let the market work it out, is how I usually feel about most things. So I wish Facebook would let the market work it out instead of setting their own guidelines based on their own agenda. But I'm glad you mentioned the console wars example, because it's a really interesting one. Because my knee-jerk reaction to regulation is like, I want less. Sort of even though I'm a lifelong Democrat, I definitely have a libertarian streak and see things a lot in that regard. But console wars is fascinating because the issue was violence in video games, that with Mortal Kombat and full motion video, people were concerned, and the games were getting quite gory. And
There you were.
yeah, and so in December of 1993, Senator Joseph Lieberman held some congressional hearings on video game violence. And if that were, even if that, when that happened at the time, or if something similar happened today, I would say like, oh, the government should stay out of that. But the net result, and what the net result that the government actually wanted, was that the companies would regulate themselves, which is what happened. They created the ESRB, and now all the video game companies, they put money in and they put the resources towards having a regulatory body and I think that's great. I don't want the government to be determining whether this game is too violent, but I would love for the Video Game Association. And again, it's just guidelines. Like, you don't, if a game is
right. Like there's a consciousness of it.
There's a consciousness of it. And I think that's this is obviously not my area of expertise, but given my limited sample size of stories that I dove into for years, I always wished that there was some sort of self-regulatory body amongst the internet companies, because I don't think it should come from the government. You can see during any of these hearings, I'm working on a project about GameStop, or watching the hearings when Zuckerberg was there and Ted Cruz asked him about Palmer and he lied again. But it does seem like our elected officials are not they're not tech savvy, and they don't even know the questions to ask. So it seems like they should be the last people to regulate things. And I would like to see the accountability come from the companies themselves, self-regulating. I don't know, maybe that's a pipe dream.
So as we're wrapping up here, maybe tell us a little bit about this next project on GameStop, and hope to have you back to talk about that and where we can follow your work and what's next for you.
Sure. So I am a filmmaker. I have a business and creative writing everything partner, Jonah Tulis. Him and I co-directed Console Wars together, and he's directing this movie about GameStop. And I'm producing it and have been, helping him along the way. I'll have more details soon about when that comes out, but it's really not, with all these stories, whether it's about Larry David or Palmer and Oculus, and this sort of speaks to modern day journalism, I think it's just so hard and kind of irresponsible to tell these stories without the people who lived it. Otherwise, you're just speculating. And so fortunately, in our case, we were lucky enough to get the OG investors who were in GameStop years before we even heard about this being a big deal, and get to see why this became a big deal and who was really there from the beginning, and this community of people that came together. So more details to come. You can follow me on social media, I guess, though I try not to go on there. I am on Twitter occasionally at, I think, Blake J. Harris NYC. And one thing I will do is if anyone ever has a question about writing, because it's hard to become a writer, and I'm grateful that I have it, or my works, whether it's criticism or a question, I always answer. So if you have any questions, you can find me on there.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Blake. Really appreciate it. I know that you just got back from California, and we'll keep my fingers crossed that you might be able to come out again. We have our gala coming up, as mentioned, in 3 weeks in a day in Malibu. But I really enjoyed reading and listening to The History of the Future. By the way, what is this? It's a great cover, but is there something about the blue?
There isn't. It's one of those things where the publisher mocked it up and sent it to me. And if we had talked about it beforehand, I would have said that's a terrible idea, but it just struck me. I saw it as twofold. I saw it as the history of virtual reality feels like it's new, but really it's just the tail end of this thing that's been going on since the 1960s, and with Ivan Sutherland. And then also because the book became so much about Palmer, that's the elephant in the room, and all we're seeing, or the dragon. Right. Palmer is the dragon in the room that we're not seeing, but he's in every scene where he's not. So I like that aspect.
Oh, that's great. All right. Well, thank you, Blake. And I want to thank all of you for joining us on the various platforms, also to the many that listen to this in its podcast form. If you enjoy these webinars, these interviews, please consider making a tax-deductible donation to the Atlas Society. We really appreciate that. We'll put the link in there. And hope you guys will join me tomorrow. I'm going to be back on Clubhouse with our senior scholar, Professor Jason Hill. And then again on Tuesday on Clubhouse with Robert Trusinski. And then next week we have our current events panel with professors Richard Salzman and of course our founder, David Kelly. So thanks everyone. Thanks, Blake.
Thanks, Jennifer. And thank you everyone out there watching.
Bye.